Welcome to Judaism Demystified. Thank you for joining us. It's really a pleasure. Your book is one of our favorites, and Bensi has been raving about you for years.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. I live in Teaneck, New Jersey. These days, I'm a rabbi of a small shul, but I also teach full time at SAR High School. I also do, and I teach Talmud and Tanakh, and I also as well, I sometimes teach in adult education settings, and I do many different things. And I went to Yeshiva University for high school, for college, for graduate school, for smicha. I learned in the kollel there, and I'm very thankful to all the different wonderful teachers that I had there, especially in terms of what we're talking about tonight. One of my closest teachers, Rabbi Shalom Karmi, who I studied very much with him and from him, and remains a very dear teacher and friend. And I learned a tremendous amount, both in terms of content and methodology. And also I had the great opportunity during the summers, a lot of wonderful teachers from Israel, a lot of academics from Israel used to come and teach at Yeshiva University and in the graduate school. And so I had a wonderful opportunity to study with Professor Yeshayahu Maori, Zichrono Livracha, Professor Avigdor Shinan, who's one of the world's experts in Midrash, and others that I had an opportunity to study with, and really learned a tremendous amount from them. And of course, studied in Israel with my Rebbe Rav Lichtenstein for many, many years, Zichrono Livracha, as well as really got a chance to study with some of the greatest of the greats in Tanakh and Machshava. I studied with Nechama Leibovitz, Zichrono Livracha. I studied with Yibadel L'Chaim Tovim, Rav Yoel bin Nun, and Rav Mordechai Breuer, Zichrono Livracha, and so was tremendously affected by all that. And I'm involved, as I said, I'm involved in chinuch of high school kids, of adults, sometimes rabbinical students, and as well as my shul here in Teaneck, Netivot Shalom. So, and I still have my first love was Tanakh and Midrash, and it continues to be, and I continue to learn from so many people. And there's also now today such wonderful new teachers who, very dear friend, Rabbi Professor Jonathan Grossman in Israel, who's become and a very dear friend. He stayed at my house a few times when he's been in America, and we've become very close, and many others, Yitzhak Shalom, and many other wonderful teachers.
You're surrounded by all-stars.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
These are seriously. So we are here to discuss your incredible book, Mikra Meaning. And to start off, we wanted to discuss your introductory essay, Between Heaven and Earth, where you discuss curricula, pedagogical choices, methodologies, and values in the study of Tanakh. We wanted to ask you if you can talk about these methodologies and how, in your experience, that enhances Yirat Shamayim.
Right. So in the introduction, it's a lengthy introduction, I speak about, that sometimes one receives a critique from the more conservative with a small c, the more Haredi elements in our community against the more modern community and their approach to study Tanakh, the focus on Pshat and the focus on trying to get at the truth and not necessarily always simply accept every Midrash as literal. And I try in that introduction to talk about the fact that, especially within the modern community that is open to the world and is open to knowledge and is open, and that's the world in which we live and breathe our air. The meaning of Yirat Shamayim is a little more complex than a simple emunat mima, where you kind of push out everything else around you. In a world which, even if that was possible to be hermetically sealed, I'm not sure it's possible anymore, but that's one kind of world. But in a world in which students and adults are reading everything, and especially those who are serious and searching for truth and interested and will be exposed and study honestly when they come to study Tanakh and they come to study Midrash, and are exposed to non-observant writings and are exposed to history and archaeology and literary theory and science and all kinds of things, the idea that one can simply ignore that and not engage with it is simply not realistic. And in the worst case scenario, you have the situation of the kid who looks back on their high school or college experience of Talmud Torah or yeshiva experience of Talmud Torah and says, "Oh, they hid things from me," or they made believe like there was no problem, but there are problems, and it's, I think, much more. It's a much healthier attitude within the cocoon of our yeshiva, day school, high school, yeshivas in Israel context to expose kids and adults in a supportive, reverent, Yirat Shamayim context to all the various methodologies that are out there to the study of Tanakh, understanding their principles, and gaining so much beauty and knowledge and depth of Torah that it actually ultimately enhances a sophisticated Yirat Shamayim. And when you can appreciate what the Torah is doing, that the Torah is not a history book, but it is something else, and that Tanakh is the prophetic take on history and how to understand it and how they're playing off of previous stories and how they're interacting with the world around them and understanding the ancient Near East, and seeing the genius of the Kitvei HaKodesh, and then ultimately the genius of Chazal in how they used Midrash to understand certain things, problems they had, etc. So I think ultimately this enhances one, certainly a modern person's Yirat Shamayim. Part of Yirat Shamayim is a search for deep truth. And sometimes, as Rambam taught us, that we have to be willing to revise certain preconceived notions for a deeper understanding of truth. But that doesn't take away from our commitment to Torah and mitzvot. Doesn't take away. In fact, it can enhance, deepen, enrich one's experience of Judaism and give a lot of joy in their Talmud Torah, and not feel in any way that one is giving up their rational faculty when they open up a sefer.
Very well said.
In regards to sources in the Geonim and Rishonim, I recall in your introduction that you also give ample evidence in the actual sources. Correct. As to the nature of how Midrash.
Yes, I mean, one of the most famous is actually printed in the Vilna Shas that every Daf Yomi learner studies. And if you look in the end of Masechet Brachot, and you have the Mavola Talmud of Rab Shmuel HaNagid, which is printed there, and where he talks about the fact that certainly when it comes to Midrash Haggadah, Midrash Halacha is a different category, but when it comes to Midrash Haggadah, when we're not dealing with any legal text, we're dealing with how old Yitzchak Avinu was when he went to the Akedah. When we ask who was the Papa Bear of who was Slavchad, and the Midrash. When you're dealing with those kinds of issues, dating issues, historical issues, not dealing with what is the meaning of totafot beinenecha. When you're dealing with Midrash Haggadah, so he says very explicitly, reflecting the consensus of the Geonim, which is that those things are not halacha l'Moshe Sinai. They weren't given down on Sinai. These are the interpretations of certain Chazal to the best of their understanding, sometimes with an agenda. Agenda is not a bad word. Agenda just means that they had a purpose in presenting a certain idea. They wanted to highlight certain themes, certain religious values. And as he says there, that which makes sense, we will accept. And that which doesn't make sense, we don't have to accept. And I would just add that, when we deal with Midrash Haggadah, my general motto, as I try to teach my students, is every Midrash Haggadah should be taken seriously. Not every Midrash Haggadah has to be taken literally. Something should be taken seriously without necessarily being taken literally, is, of course, something that Rambam taught us long ago, but it's already in the Geonim as a central theme, and it becomes very, very, very central to many of the Rishonim that we love and learn from. There are, of course, there was a certain strand that didn't go that way, and certainly in the Haredi community, that became the dominant strand in the modern period. But, again, the majority of the Rishonim and the Geonim took a very different approach. They were very reverential to all the Midrashei Agadah that they learned. They took them seriously, but they also tried to understand what it was saying, and they didn't always agree with it. When it came to Pshuto Shel Mikra, the Ibn Ezra left and right disagrees with certain things. Rambam disagrees with certain things. Ramban disagrees with certain things when he doesn't think that that's Pshuto Shel Mikra, the plain sense of the text. And, and I think that we're continuing in that mode, in that model, that, the derech salal lanu Rishonim, that the Rishonim kind of started for us.
So do you think that the Geonim and Rishonim were aware of the idea of intertextuality, or do you think that intertextuality is kind of because intertextuality requires, in a way, you need to have technology because you have to have all of the, no, really, it's
right. So look, I think the answer, or not the answer, but I think the approach is, I think, yes, Big Gadol, they were aware of it. They just didn't necessarily do it systematically.
Right.
Meaning, just like many things if you look at Rishonim, they often will note certain things, certain philological comments. They'll notice certain things. The Rashbam talks about derech hamikraot. This is the way that biblical Hebrew does it. The thing is, they didn't write a systematic treatise on that necessarily, but they threw out these little comments. In a certain sense, when the Ramban, notices, comparisons between the story of, Pilegesh Begiv'ah and previous stories in Tanakh, that's a kind of he noticed certain patterns. When there are midrashim that say, Eliyahu Hanavi did many of the things that Moshe Rabbeinu did. He also fasted for 40 days, and he went to Har Chorev. Meaning, the midrashim that do that, the thing is, they don't necessarily do it systematically in every case, and there are many situations where they didn't comment on it. But you have all kinds of examples of it. And the more Midrash you know, and the more Mefarshim you know, the more you can see that almost many of the things, not everything, Chazal say, Makom hiniach lanu lihitgader bo, they left things, but you'll see that many of the techniques and many of the ideas are hinted at in certain midrashim, sometimes made explicit in certain midrashim, sometimes made explicit, but it's not the unique thing is to try to do this systematically and see certain things over and over and over again and apply it as a method as much as you can throughout a sefer, and you see things. Once you have the method, you see more and more those things, and using keywords and using patterning and using. So, and I don't think you're right that you can see more with technology, because you can see how many times does this word appear and this concept. But you don't have to necessarily need a GPT or an AI. All you need is a good concordance and a good zikaron of Tanakh.
Yes. Well, Tanakh is huge.
That's why you have a concordance, and concordance started in the late Middle Ages. So
Okay, fantastic.
For us, this is such an important lesson, because I know so many people who got turned off by Midrash because they were taught, the literalist version of it. And, we're trying to kind of show everybody that we don't need to get rid of Midrash. We actually should show you how to properly study it, how to appreciate it.
And appreciate different categories of Midrash, meaning there are some Midrashim that are trying to answer an exegetical problem in the text. And that's one type of Midrash. And there's another type of Midrash, which is using the text as a springboard, just like, the rabbi in shul uses the text. A drasha was using the text as a springboard. And there are other Midrashim that are engaging in polemic against the, dominant Roman culture that they confronted. And there are other Midrashim which are, interested in telling sipurei ma'aseh about Chazal and about others. Meaning, there's all these different genres of Midrashim, and you have to know what you're doing with. And then you have to see, does the Midrash fit into this? How far away is it from the Pshuto Shel Mikra? And if it is far away, what do you think they're doing when they do this? What are the Midrashim trying to convey, and what are they trying to say, and what do they say to us? These are all important questions. And are they engaging in a polemic of their time? Are they engaging in a philosophical question? Are they engaging in, a real exegetical question that this was an approach, and you can agree, you can disagree. They saw something strange in the text. Sometimes the Midrash, has a deeper understanding of the broader context than just this pasuk. And that's also important. So, yeah.
Can you weigh in on maybe why it's happened, like this trend of treating Midrash the way, the common yeshivas do today? Like, why do you think that happened? Why are we moving away from
the strands of, okay.
I think part of it, goes back to the Haskalah and the Enlightenment. When, Orthodox Jew, they didn't call it that then, but when traditional Jewry saw itself very much under attack and very much and being exposed to more modern approaches, often led to a diminishing of observance. And so they kind of cut out all of that and saw it as part and parcel of the modern approach. And anything that wasn't, exactly the way that they had learned in very, very traditional contexts became a threat. And so you pushed very much. So you pushed aside a lot of the Rishonim who took a more nuanced and balanced approach to understanding Midrash and the differences between Pshat and Drash. And especially given the fact that, the early Reform movement and the early Haskalah started to undermine not just Midrash Agadah from their point of view, but Midrash Halacha, and started to talk about that there was biblical Judaism and there was rabbinic Judaism and there's late rabbinic Judaism. And so that became very much a threat. And so anytime you talk about distinctions between Pshat and Drash, all of a sudden people became very frightened that, maybe the Rashbam could talk about that the Pshat of the text, ukshartem la'ot al yadecha, the oat might mean, literally an oat as a figurative, and Chazal had the drash that it means this, and both are true. But in the 1780s and 1790s and 1850s, somebody who is exposed to that kind of thinking says, whoa, so that means I don't really have to put on tefillin. And, so it became very much, it reminds me, I think I mentioned it in the introduction. One of the great Rosh Yeshivas of the post-war era, Rav Avram Bloch of Telz Yeshiva. So he writes in a letter, he talks about how, unfortunately, in his day, we gave Hebrew up to the Maskilim because they saw Hebrew so much, especially the early, because the early Maskilim in Eastern Europe, they saw Yiddish as, a very debased language of the old ways and the old country. And they said, no, we're going to speak in Hebrew. And so Hebrew became usher in certain circles. It became verboten in certain circles because it was associated with the modern trends of the free thinkers and the people who were less observant. And so he bemoans the fact that we gave up Hebrew and now we're giving up Tanakh and we're giving up, so that's something that happened in history.
Yeah. Well, we're happy that we have people like you bringing it back, and we're very excited for what's to come, because right now we're going to get up to one of our favorite parts, which is the first chapter of your book. You delve into an in-depth study of the famous Midrash regarding Avraham Avinu's youth, shattering of his father's idols, and the confrontation with Nimrod. This Midrash is used as a model for the study of intertextuality of Midrash and Drash. Can you discuss the insights you uncovered with this Midrash and how it relates more broadly to the study of intertextuality?
Sure. And in fact, this is a case of what I call not only intertextuality, but reverse intertextuality, which I'll talk about at the end. As I mentioned before, there are different kinds of midrashim, and sometimes the most challenging midrashim are the ones that purport to fill in gaps in the biblical narrative. But you ask yourself, where does it come from? Because there's no inkling at all. In fact, when you read the Torah, you have no inkling at all that why HaKadosh Baruch Hu chose Avraham to be the progenitor of Am Yisrael, of the Jewish people. It just he has no origin story. He just kind of shows up, 75 years old, and he's called. We have no sense of why he's called, as opposed to Noach. The Bible at least says, "V'Noach matzachein b'nei Hashem," meaning it seems that Noach did something good in the eyes of God. We don't know exactly what he did, but Avraham is a blank slate. Later on in the biblical text, you could talk about, we see Avraham fighting on behalf of Sodom. We see that Avraham is a kind of welcoming person. So in retrospect, we get a glimpse of why God may have chosen Avraham, but not from the beginning. So we understand the rabbi's desire, like all of us, to have an origin story, that people don't just show up. And especially, again, and this is a little bit more scientific, we know that certainly in all ancient literatures like Midrash, heroes don't simply show up. They have to have a backstory. They have to be unique and special and have been trained, and they show up, till today. In comic books, every superhero has to have an origin story. So we understand the origin, the need, but why specifically this story? And why this emphasis on destroying the idols, which itself is very counter the Pshuto Shel Mikra, because when you study the Avraham stories and the Yitzchak stories and the Yaakov stories, Avodah Zarah is not a major theme. It's not like in Sefer Shoftim, where Avodah Zarah is like a constant challenge. You don't see that by Avraham. You don't see them all, so it's really a totally new reading back into the text.
It also, if I may, it's striking how the Avraham of this Midrash is very different than the Avraham in the Torah, because, Avraham in the Torah is very calculated. He lies about Sarah being his sister twice.
Right.
He's not this like blind faith guy who's just willing to jump in a furnace.
Correct. And here is a very different, right. So as I mentioned, it's striking that while the story, as it presented in Midrash Rabbah and other sources, and it's a very ancient Midrash, as I try to show academically, it appears in the Book of Jubilees, one of the Apocrypha, which means that, the people in the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls community were reading such Midrashim that was floating around. This idea was floating. So I said, it's true that it doesn't appear by Avraham, but it appears explicitly in another biblical text, which is very rooted in the time of Avodah Zarah, and that's the story of Gideon. In Gideon, you have a mamish the story. You have a son who is very pious and righteous, and destroys the Mizbeach Labal, destroys the altar of his father's idols at night, which is what the Book of Jubilee says. And he destroys it. And after that, he's in He's in a tremendous amount of danger to be killed by the locals, and he is saved by the hand of God. There's also a mocking of the gods by there. The father, says the Baal should protect himself, and here Abraham mocks the gods in the Midrashic story. And so you see that there is a lot of it's exactly the same story, which Chazal kind of cut and lifted and pasted into the Midrashic story, which is clearly what we call intertextuality, in the sense that the Midrash, so to speak, Gideon took it from the Midrash took it from the Gideon story. On the other hand, I wanted to suggest that why did the rabbis feel that this was the perfect origin story to, so to speak, put on Abraham? Because if you look carefully, there are many elements in the Gideon story that clearly echo the Avraham story in Tanakh, where Gideon, many of the phrases, he sees an angel appears to him, he feeds an angel, he takes care of the angel, and many of those elements which appear by Avraham then appear by Gideon. And
do
so
you remember a few off the top of your head?
One of the most famous.
I think they went out with 300 men, right?
He went out with 300 men. Again,
there's a lot.
There were a lot of things.
3 pages in your book. There was like 3 pages in your book worth of stuff.
Yeah, correct. Right. He says, Abraham, says, "Hitalech lefanai v'heyei tamim," and the angel, and he says, "Atayadati kirei elokim ata," and I'm sorry, this is by Yirat. Sorry, so number one, Gideon takes. We find Gideon comes and the angel sits under a tree, which of course is very similar to Avraham. He sha'ein tachat ha'etz, sit down under the tree. The angels sit down under the tree. Gideon offers them food, and he offers them some meat and basar and efat kemach matzot and marak and a broth, which is of course very similar to Avraham, which consists, Avram brings them bread and meat. And it's interesting that the Midrash says that it was Pesach, that he offered them matzot. There's a kind of Midrash on top of a Midrash. And just as Avraham said, Bameh Eda ki rashena, how will I know? So too, Gideon uses the same terminology. It's very rare. Bameh Eda, Bameh Oshia Israel, through what? And once again, here he says, God says to Gideon, Shalom lecha al tira, which is the same phrase that he uses for Avraham, al tira. Okay. Gideon says to Hashem, Al yichar apcha bi va'adabra ach hapa'am anaseh na rak hapa'am, which of course reminds us of Avraham in the vikuach, in his discussion, in his argument with God about Sodom, where he also uses the same term, Al na yichar la Adonai va'adabran ach hapa'am. Again, you see all these linguistic parallels that clearly Gideon seems to be, or the writer of the book of Shoftim more correctly, is making a conscious effort that the reader will understand the character of Gideon as mivusas on Avraham Avinu, as linking him to Avraham Avinu. And that's very powerful because it just puts Gideon in a different sphere. And in fact, Gideon is the one who is offered to be the Melech. He's the one who's offered to be the king. He could have stopped Sefer Shoftim. We would have stopped it right there. We would have started Sefer Melachim. And it's Dafka. And as you said correctly, Gideon goes up with the 300 soldiers, just like Avram goes up with the 300 soldiers, and the many other parallels. So I suggested, as a kind of reverse intertextuality, is that once Chazal saw that Gideon was patterned in the biblical text on Avraham Avinu, so they went a step further and they said, so if Gideon is patterned on Avram, maybe Avram on a midrashic level can be patterned on Gideon, and we can gain insights about things that are missing in the life of Avraham from the life of Gideon as it's presented in Tanakh. And they did that. And they do that in many, many instances. And I give other examples in that article. And there are many other instances. Just to give you one example, I don't know if I don't think it's in that article, but it says that when Avraham was when he went to walk for the Akedah, Vayaret hamakom merachok, he saw the place from afar, and Chazal say Ra'a anan kashur. He saw a cloud kind of ringing that mountain. He knew, oh, that's the mountain. Again, where did they get that? And again, if you look and you'll see that there's at the end in the story of Matan Torah in chapter 24 of the book of Exodus. So the Bible presents the, so to speak, the end part of Matan Torah, of the Revelation, chapter 24. The whole debate whether it happened after Matan or right the same time as Matan Torah. But the Bible uses language which is very strikingly similar to the Akedah there. Vayashkem, they got up early in the morning. And there's the Na'arei Yisrael. The Jews, the children go up and see God. I mean, there's a seeing of God. Hashem Yireh. There's a lot of echoes of the Akedah, which makes perfect sense. It's a revelation of God par excellence. Oh, but at the very end of that, it says, and Vayishkon ha'anan al hahar. So the rabbis said, well, if Matan Torah is patterned on the Akedat Yitzchak, the revelation, and they bring korbanot there, they bring olot there, just like at the end of Akedat Yitzchak. So then Akedat Yitzchak must have had elements of Matan Torah in it. So there's a lot of intertextuality in Midrashim going back and forth.
This is incredible. I have a question for you, which I'm wondering. So do you think that when the rabbis, when the sages, when the sages noticed this pattern, and they noticed this intertextual link, and they said to themselves, okay, like you said, let's just do with Gidon, it's easier for me. So Gidon, right, is modeled modeled on Avraham, right? So therefore, since we have that origin story with Gidon, we can model Avram from Gidon.
Right.
Do you think they thought, therefore, that means that the origin story of Avram in their minds, in their perspective, do you think that means that they think that that's actually what happened? Or to have the creative license to be able to do that via the intertextual link,
right, is
enough to allow it to be presented as a midrash?
I think
what do you think that they actually thought?
I think this is just a thought, because again, I know. What I think is that the original authors of that midrash, that first generation or second generation, thought in your second formulation. They did not necessarily think that that's what actually happened, but it's something that could have happened, and it's something that enriches and helps us deepen our understanding of Avraham Avinu. It's something that could have happened to Avraham Avinu. I don't think they necessarily believed it actually did happen to Avraham Avinu. In subsequent generations, meaning when people like Rashi or someone, in the 1300s read that midrash, they, I think, believed that it happened.
Right.
But if you ask me, the original writers, because there are many statements, there's a famous statement in the Gemara, I think it's in Shabbat I have to look about Kolmad de Darshinan. Anything that you can darshan, which I take to mean that there was that sort of what you said, that kind of creative license that they saw as enriching the biblical narrative and filling in gaps and enriching and the characters and making it something that teaches us. Torah is an unending source of wisdom and guidance. And therefore they saw this as guiding us and fitting into the broad narrative of what Avraham Avinu comes to teach us.
Yeah, you know what's fascinating? Oh, I'm sorry, that you were talking.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Do you know what's fascinating? The Rambam, okay, famously looks very down upon taking Midrashim literally.
Correct.
Right? Takes it extremely seriously. In fact, says that Midrash contains the Sodot and all that, right? Of course, great. But in this story with Avraham, for some reason, if you look in the Mishnah Torah, he literally outlines the entire Midrash in the Mishnah Torah, coded into halacha, meaning it's within. It's almost hard to say that the Rambam, for some reason, with this Midrash, took it literally. I wonder what you thought about that.
I mean, but remember, if I'm not mistaken, the Rambam's presentation of Abraham there in Hilchot Avodah Zarah is like this kind of philosopher who kind of,
but he has the elements of the Midrash in the narrative.
He has elements of the Midrash.
Yes, it's not exactly the same.
It is interesting. Sometimes an idea is so wedded to, is so ensconced in the tradition and in the, so to speak, and into the mother's milk of the community that you can't ignore it. So, I think that, I think that is something, I'd have to do more research, but sometimes an idea.
I just thought I'd bring it up.
I think it's an important, point.
That's
sometimes an idea.
That's exactly what I was going to bring up myself because.
Oh my God, so sorry.
No, it's perfect because, I think that the interesting part of it is that Gidon's story is talking about Avodah Zarah and this whole. I think the best part and the most important part of the Midrash is not necessarily the jumping in the fiery furnace or the breaking of the idols, because the breaking of the idols is already the ancient understanding of Avodah Zarah. But as Chazal and as humanity matures, the idolatry becomes more sophisticated. So the response to idolatry has to also become more refined. And what happens is this story. Why I think the Rambam held it at such high regard is that it feeds into his idea of negative theology. The whole argument between Avraham and Nimrod is about what God is not.
Right. Interesting. Very interesting.
Right, but I would just say to that personally that he could have used that in the Moreh Nevuchim for that. He didn't have to code it into Mishnah Torah. The coding it into Mishnah Torah makes it more. I guess open for debate. I guess. And if it was just in the Moreh, then yeah, you know what I mean. But anyway, I just thought that was an interesting point.
That was very interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. We want to now talk about the 8th chapter of your book, which you discuss. Which you discuss the story of Moshe striking the rock, and you offer a fresh perspective on understanding both Moshe's actions and the consequences that follow. Can you share your insights on this narrative with us?
Yes. Now, this chapter is, a kind of analysis. When you have, this very difficult problem, everyone's, Shadal writes, Moshe Rabbeinu committed one Aveirah, and when you finish reading the Mefarshim, it has 17 different Aveirot, and when you have 17 different understandings, it often raises the problem of, do we really know anything, is it so difficult? And then, of course, the moral question or moral problem of, what did he do that was so terrible here that he lost entry into the land of Israel because of it? There seem to be other, quote unquote, mistakes, sins that Moshe makes in other parts of the narrative, which seem to be much worse. And yet the Bible constantly connects his not going into the land of Israel. You didn't sanctify my name. There was a kind of missed opportunity. The story of Moshe Rabbeinu hitting the rock in Parshat Chukat is presented in the Bible as that's the reason he doesn't enter the land of Israel. You didn't, because you didn't sanctify my to the eyes of Bnei Yisrael. And it's clear that there's a lost opportunity. And I mentioned that it's a very difficult story because, number one, we don't understand what's so terrible about hitting the rock as opposed to speaking to the rock. There are other sins that Moshe committed which seem to be worse in the Bible. Number one. Number two, the fact is that God told Moshe to hit the rock back in Parashat Balak, and it's presented as a normal, beautiful thing. And he seemed to convince the Jewish, the people there and solve the problem. So what's so terrible about it? And the fact that there's so many different answers leads one to think that, something is not there. Simply saying that you hit the rock and something's got to be underlying the story. And so I went through different mefarshim and looked at them, but they all kind of leave you a little bit hanging and not satisfied. And I think that the key to this is, like in many situations, is placement and language and placement. The fact is, this is the first story of the second generation, as understood by most of the commentaries, in the plain sense of the text. The plain sense of the text is, we had Parshat Shlach, which was the story of the spies, and Ma'apilim, and the Jewish people are told that they're not going to enter the land of Israel. So we have, that seems to occur at the beginning of the second year. It seems very clear from the text. We have the story of Korach right before that, which seems to also take place during the desert experience, the first generation, maybe very early, maybe in the middle, it's unclear. But by the time we get to chapter 20, we find Miriam is dying. Later on in chapter 20, Aharon dies. And we know from the end of Sefer Bamidbar that Aharon died. Explicitly, it says he died in the 40th year. So chapter 20, we're in the end. And yet this is the first narrative that we have of the second generation. This is the first narrative of the second generation. So that's very significant. And when you look carefully at the two stories, so on the surface, meaning the story in Bishalach and the story here, they seem to be similar, so similar that Bechor Shor makes the radical claim that it's the same story, and just one is filling in the details of others, which is very radical and leads to all kinds of interesting discussions, a kind of proto-biblical criticism, but okay. But the plain sense is that these are two different stories, one occurring very early in the narrative when the Jewish people just left Egypt, as opposed to here at the very end of the beginning of the second generation's stories, narrative in the Bible. And if you look carefully at the language, you start to see differences, small differences, but important differences. Back in Parshat Bishalach, the Bible doesn't present it as a whole theological question where the people say, why did we leave Egypt? It seems to be a water problem. They have a water problem. They need water, just like they needed food in the middle of Parshat Bishalach, and God provided food through the man. So too here, God provides water. And it's very interesting that Moses does not do the miracle in front of Am Yisrael. It says, Le'enei ziknei Yisrael. It's only done Le'enei ziknei Yisrael. The first generation simply had a problem. Moshe Rabbeinu solved the problem. He showed the elders how you solve this kind of a problem. It was not a major theological. It's not the issue. The Jewish people are going to experience, they just experienced Yetziat Mitzrayim. They're going to experience the revelation at Sinai. It's the need of the hour is very different. However, 40 years later, this is the second generation. Many of them did not stand at the foot of Sinai. Their parents were dead. The water story is presented in a much broader context. It's not just about water. It's about, will God lead them? Will God take care of them? What is their connection? The Bible doesn't talk about, and here Moshe Rabbeinu has an opportunity in the language of God, l'haktisheni, to sanctify le'enei b'nei Yisrael. This is in the midst of the Jewish people, that they should see the power of God, they should see the caring of God, the providence of God. And Moshe Rabbeinu reacts in the same way he did 38 years ago. He uses the same categories, the same method that he used 38 years ago. And that's why he's not the right leader anymore, because the whole point is to understand the different generation. The whole point is the tactic that you used 38 years ago, that's exactly the point. You use the exact same tactic, but this is a new generation, and a new generation needs different tactics.
And dafka, as I use the term there, the halachic term, gilui milta, it's reflective of the fact that Moses is no longer in touch directly with the needs of the people and what this generation needs. And therefore, it's not so much a chait and onesh, a sin and punishment, as more of a consequence that's reflective. It reveals that it's time for Moshe Rabbeinu to retire and new blood to come in. So that's the basic idea. I tried to show it in the text, tried to show it with the language, and I think that it makes sense in the context of the narrative.
Makes a lot of sense. And the next chapter, the 9th chapter of your book, you discuss the Parashat of Balak and its unique character in the Bible. You emphasize how the story is like out of place with the rest of the books of Tanakh, of Moshe. This is followed by very interesting thematic parallels to the book of Shemot, suggesting that these parallels are the key to unlocking this parsha. Can you elaborate on that?
I mean, this is an example of something with more broad theme in the entire book of Bamidbar, which is that the second generation experiences many of the same challenges, obviously in different forms because it's new people, new geography, new situations, but they experience many of the similar threats that the first generation did, and they overcome those threats. Sometimes they overcome the mistakes that the first generation makes, which is symbolic. It says that's why the second generation can enter the land of Israel. They have their own, so to speak, Yetziat Mitzrayim and threat from Balak. Balak is presented like Paro, and he is presented as a threat to them, and they are able to overcome that threat. And it's interesting that in many of the Midrashim, the text, places Bilam together with Yitro back in Paro's court, all the way back. You have all these connections. Then you have the literary connections about, that the Jewish people are seen as a threat to Balak in the same way that they were seen as a threat to Paro. And many of the language, and the fact that in the blessings of Bilam, he makes much reference to Yetziat Mitzrayim over and over again. And again, all these things. But it's part of a broader pattern that the second generation experiences their own kind of situation. So, Baal Peor is a kind of Chet HaEgel of the second generation. You have a lot of language there that echoes, right after Chet HaEgel, God says, I'm going to make a covenant with you, and don't call their daughters in Parshat Mishpat, in Parshat Kitisa. Don't call their daughters. They're going to call you to do Avodah Zarah, which is exactly what happens in Baal Peor. How do you overcome the sin of Baal Peor? It's kind of the Chet HaEgel of the second generation. You have the sin, you have the potential sin of the Bnei Gad, Bnei Ruvain, where you have a sort of second Chet HaMeraglim, except that it's reversed. In the story of the Meraglim, you had the 10 tribes who did evil, and the 2 tribes who did good. Yoshua from Ephraim, from the sons of Joseph, the Leah line, and Kalev ben Yefuneh to Yehuda from the Rachel line, Yosef, Ephraim, and Yehuda from the Leah line, the 2 foci of centers of power. And in the story of Bnei Gad, Bnei Ruvain, it's flipped. You have the 10 tribes who are willing to go into the land of Israel, not to stay out of the land of Israel. And you have the 2 tribes who are also the Bechor, but they're the ones who are rejected. Reuven, who was replaced by Yehuda. And you have God, who always goes together with Reuven because he's the firstborn of the Shifcha of Reuven, of Bilhah, of Zilpah. And Menashe, of course, is the son who was replaced by Ephraim. So you have, in the story of the Meraglim, you have Ephraim and Yehuda. You have Yehuda and Yosef through Ephraim. And here you have the flip. So it's, again, this is kind of a part of a kind of broader, grander theme of the second generation experiencing many of the challenges of the first generation and overcoming them or flipping them or doing it a little different, which leads to their ability, symbolic of their ability to enter the land of Israel and continue the mission.
So why I wanted to bring this specific chapter into the pod is because there's intertextuality with Midrash, but then there's also intertextuality within the text itself.
Right.
And the enlightening and very insightful thing here is that the Torah, as far as I'm understanding, right, the Torah is sort of pointing you or signifying to you,
right,
echoing things to you, so that if you want to understand what is going on over here, you got to go back over there. And then when you interplay both ideas together, now the text is opened up, and the reader can gain insight as to what's going on.
Right.
That's why I wanted to.
And this continues throughout the Bible. It continues throughout the Tanakh, where stories play off of other stories, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, and themes play off, kind of major themes keep playing off of each other. Is it a second Exodus? Is it a second Matan Torah? Is it a second Kriyat Yamsuf? Is it a second? And then characters play off of each other. Are they the same? Are they fixing, to use Kabbalistic terms, tikkun? Are they correcting the mistakes of their forefathers? So yeah. Now, some of this you asked about before, about people who have done. So the Ramban very famously quoted the idea of Ma'aseh Avot Siman Lebanim, which is really a sense of understanding that what happens later is patterned on what happened earlier, but he uses it in a limited fashion, in specific. And again, the question is, do you do it systematically? Do you broaden it, and do you do it not just specifically with the avot, but with many other things going on?
Right. These are such important principles. And for the final question, we're going to go off of intertextuality and pick your brain on hashkafa for a minute.
Sure.
Amalek has long been an uncomfortable subject for modern Jews. Many ethical and moral challenges have been grappled with in regards to Amalek by Jewish philosophers and halachists for centuries. In the 17th chapter of your book, you delve into the philosophical and halachic development regarding the commandment to wipe out Amalek, eventually arriving at important resolutions for today's modern Jewry, if you can enlighten us.
Sure. That chapter is a little bit different than the other chapters in the book.
Yeah.
And the fact that it
we want to give you a well-rounded. We want to show
something that I had written, and I felt, it was something that I had written at one point and felt, hadn't gotten a lot of airplay, and I thought, I'm publishing a book. I think this is an important theme, so I stuck it in after I was talking about David and Shaul. So Amalek is a very, it's part of the broader question about the interaction of halacha and morality, or Torah and ethics, and which, in the Bible deals with all kinds of, very big questions like Amalek, Ben Soreru Moreh, Ir Hanidachat, lots of things like that, the killing of the 7 nations, and genocide and all those questions, but trickle down to the modern period when we deal with all kinds of challenges of our sense of morality versus halacha, the mamzer, aguna, women's issues, homosexuality. I mean, there's so many challenges that we have. So I use this as a kind of method, as one type of, you see how sensitive many later thinkers were when they confronted. They didn't simply throw their hands up in the air and say, what do you mean morality? You're just westernized, Hellenized. The Torah says you do it. That's it. The Torah is the standard, and that's it. There is no morality outside of Torah, etc. Again, this is a broader question. As modern Orthodox Jews, I think we are very much inclined. This goes back to the famous question of the Euthyphro in Aristotle and Plato. There's a famous dialogue.
Incredible dialogue.
Right. So the famous question is, do the gods do that which is holy because it is holy, or is it holy because the gods do it? So take off the S. For us, it's the God. Does God do something does God do that which is ethical because it's ethical, or whatever God says is perforce ethical, which of course touches on broad questions. In general, I certainly learned from my teachers that the mainstream Jewish response, I'm not saying the only, but the mainstream Jewish response argues that, yes, God doesn't simply do things capriciously, and we say that whatever God, Avraham, the only way Avraham can challenge God and say, Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat, assumes that there's a thing called mishpat, that human beings can access and hold God up to judgment. Otherwise, God should have simply said to Avraham, shut up, you puny little human being. You don't know anything. You don't see anything. Like he said to Job, you weren't there when things started. Who are you to talk to me? That's not what Hashem does. Hashem gets into a debate and plays by the rules of Avraham. Yes, if there's 40, meaning he tries to show that it's morally justified. So that's the general approach that I think emerges from the mainstream of Tanakh and Machshava. And so when we confront the dilemma of Amalek, it's a dilemma. Yeah, on the one hand, Amalek is terrible and they should be killed. But the idea that subsequently every single person, 2,000, 5,000 years later, who has nothing to do with the original Amalekites, that they should be killed is very challenging theologically, morally, even halachically. And so in that essay, I tried to show, first of all, I tried to show on a pshat level, it's far from clear that the way that we understand how to deal with Amalek is what the Torah said in Parshat Ki Teitzei, this week's Parsha. Perfect. This week's Parasha. When the Torah says, Timched Zecher Amalek, it doesn't say there, get rid of every man, woman, and child. When it says Timched Zecher Amalek, it could be a turn of a phrase which simply means destroy Amalek. Destroy Amalek, like when we say we're going to wipe them off the map. It doesn't literally mean you're going to kill every single. In war, it's going to be a total war. We're going to, totally devastate them, like the United States did in World War II. They totally devastated many German cities. They didn't go around hunting for every German man, woman, and child, but they carpet bombed and they destroyed Dresden and other cities. And they didn't care about the collateral damage. That's one way to read it on a pshat level. In Sefer Shmuel, the Navi does go and say specifically, mi tafa'ad, yonek, ma'ad olal, etc. There he does talk about men, women, and children. So in Sefer Shmuel, you have that. Here too, you can interpret it as what he meant was you go and you fight without any barriers, no Geneva Conventions, you just go and destroy. But it doesn't mean that you go and kill every Amaleki. That's clearly in later strands of the tradition, it was interpreted that it is a mitzvah to go and destroy every individual Amaleki. Not all halachists believe that. If I was rewriting it today, it's 12 years, it's 10 years later, more than that, I would have included the fact that there's actually a famous comment of the Brisker Rav who says that, the idea that you can go and kill every single last Amaleki is only if you have a tzav from the Navi directly, because it doesn't say that explicitly in the Torah. Only if you have a direct commandment from a Navi. That's what he says. Number two, there are others who point out that this is a Klal Yisrael mitzvah. It's not a mitzvah to each individual Jew, which is also, however, there are many, including Rambam and Sefer HaChinuch, who say that it is an individual mitzvah on every single person to go and kill Amalek. So which is kind of the standard understanding that the average Jew today, from Jew, believes. So how do we deal with that? So, one approach that you find very popular is to say, well, yeah, it's true on a theoretical level, but Lamaisa, God saved us this moral problem because he mixed up all the nations, and we don't have to worry about it. But again, that's a little bit of a cop-out because, so I brought there the fact that if you look in a number of the Achronim, they take it in a different direction, and they're not simply willing to accept it at face value, and they're willing to engage and engage in exegesis and engage in deep thinking. And so for example, you have this beautiful approach of the Avnei Nezer, Avraham Avinu, one of the great Achronim, where he writes that, the whole idea of Amalek, of killing their offspring and their subsequent generations, makes no sense because it goes against the Torah. The Torah says, Lo yumtu avot al banim, ubanim lo yumtu al avotam. Now, it's an amazing comment because in Pshat, that only applies to a Beit Din. That in the context, that pasuk is said in the context of a judicial system, you can't have vicarious punishment, which was very common in the ancient Near East. You can't kill a son for the sins of the father, or the father for the sins of the son. Can't do that. Number one. Number two, it seems to be to the Jewish court. Here, he does two things. He takes it out of the realm of Beit Din, and he puts it in the realm of the conflict, the theological, metaphysical conflict between Am Yisrael and Amalek. Number two, he talks about it as applying to non-Jews as well, this principle of Lo Yumtu Avot Abanim. And he says, therefore, the only way that you can interpret this is only if the generations later are actually engaging in Amalekite behavior. So he basically makes a shift from a genetic, ethnic move to a behavioral category for Amalek, which is a radical rereading of the tradition. But again, this is an attempt to solve the problem, and it's a legitimate attempt, and it's within the boundaries of the tradition that someone can say this and goes in that direction, which again is fascinating, and again tells you that Sharei ha Perush lo nin alu, and that this is also part of the ongoing conversation when we deal with the challenge of halacha and morality, not to simply dismiss our moral claim, our moral qualms as, we're just westernized, whatever. The Sachat Chaver wasn't westernized, but these are inherently Jewish. It's an internal battle within the system, and how to work these out is part of the beauty and the challenge of Jewish thought and halacha.
We actually had a podcast with Rabbi Dr. Eugene Korn on this exact topic and this theme. So for anybody who hasn't heard that, you could definitely go back and enjoy it. And we're going to be doing it hopefully with a surprise guest soon as well. But your input here was really, really valuable. And I wanted to ask you before we go, if you have anything to plug. You have a book coming out.
You better be working on a book.
No, I don't. Right now, I'm so busy with my shul is growing, and I'm writing. From time to time, I'm writing. And one of these days, if I write more, today most books, unless you have a lot of time, most books come out of writing articles, and then later you put them together. People have an internet series, and they put together a series. So we'll see. But
I saw that you wrote for Rabbi Angel's Conversations.
Yes.
Yes.
From time to time, he asks me to write, and other things that I write, and but I also have other things. Thank you, but I appreciate the plug.
Absolutely, and honestly, this book, you said you wrote it 10 years ago, but in my mind, it's a classic because really it goes through a lot of the fundamental concepts of intertextuality that has grown today exponentially all over. It's sort of for the modern Orthodox world, it's become it's taken on a life of its own, and you do a great job in your book. Not only showing it in specific midrashim, but also presenting the general idea of it. And we want to thank you for coming on. We hope we can do it. I
appreciate it. I want to give you guys chizuk on everything that you're doing, and it's really important. And it just adds to the seriousness and integrity of our community. And you mentioned a plug. I don't have any plug. I don't have a book to plug, but I love coming and talking to other people. I love visiting communities. If anybody wants, so that's my only plug.
I think I have to come visit you in your community.
Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time. And this was awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Erev Tov.
Thank you.